Curious what happens if you spin a square blank? Let's see. Okay, so for this demonstration, what I've set up is 3 different 2-inch squares, one out of aluminum, one out of copper, and one out of pewter. The aluminum and copper are both 20 gauge, and the pewter is just a little bit thicker. It comes in 1 millimeter, and so that's about 18 gauge. And I've just drawn out the center of the square to help with centering it up on the lathe. And I've gone ahead and done some samples so you can see the differences between the aluminum, the copper, and the pewter. With the copper, I did take it off the lathe, anneal it, put it back on, and spin it further. And what's interesting about spinning a square is that you don't end up with that concentric round lip. You get this kind of undulation and these points for each one of the squares as it gets spun up into a vessel form. Another interesting thing that happens is since you can't trim the metal, there's a certain amount of faceting that happens up towards the squares and at the bottom point of that square that isn't as sort of smooth and concentric as the rest of the piece. So since you can't trim it and as you're spinning on the piece and there's stress putting on the metal, it goes out to the edge, and since that edge is an irregular square as opposed to a circle, then you'll see the different forces kind of manifest themselves in the metal. So you get some faceting or flatness along the points of the square sticking up as it's getting spun down to the lathe. So what I'm going to do is set these blanks up on the lathe and let you see how the process goes. Okay, so what I've done is I've pre-waxed or lubricated the blanks and centered up the aluminum in the chuck, and I have the undersized follower block just so I can get it seated onto this chuck. And instead of changing the follower block 2 more times, I'm just going to seat all 3 blanks, then we'll change a follower block and then spin the rest of those down. A couple things that you really want to watch while spinning a square blank is you want to stay far away from that edge. Those corners are sticking out and can really tear through a glove or something like that. Also, you can't trim it, so wherever you get it placed with your follower block and chuck, that's where it's going to be. You could put it off center on purpose or be real precise and get it centered up. I'm kind of somewhere in between where it's slightly off center. And just want to watch those edges while you're spinning. Also, it helps to have a higher RPM as you're spinning in the area where the corners are sticking up, but you have air. That'll help the tool ride on that space and not bounce around too much. And you'll see that a little bit later. So got that set. Then we'll get this seated. So just a couple passes just to get it firmly seated at the bottom of that chuck so I can recenter it when I take it off. And you'll notice that the square ends tend to spring back a little bit. That's natural just because the tension or forces within the metal are going to be different with a square blank than a circular blank. And then I'll just get the copper blank seated. And with these smaller, thinner blanks, it's not a lot of force, but it's just being really delicate. You can use a fair amount of force just to get it seated at the bottom there. But you really want to watch how much force you're using on the tool. It's more of a finesse and precision with these smaller spinnings. And there you can see the square corners of the blank kind of springing back naturally a little bit on the copper. And for the last blank, we'll get the pewter seated. And I know it's an extra step kind of changing follower blocks, but I really like being able to get in there and have it seated nice and firmly against the foot of the chuck so that you can get it placed exactly where you want it when you switch out the follower block, because that larger oversized follower block won't let you get in there with the tool. We'll start again with the aluminum. Make sure everything's tightened down. It's exactly where you place it, that's where it's going to stay. So again, I'm not using very much force on the aluminum. Too much force further out towards the edge of the piece can put too much pressure on the base and cause it to tear out. And I'm watching the silhouette of the spinning kind of through the form, looking at that back wall there to see whatever shape I want to end up with. And obviously you can stop the lathe and check it as well. And for this demonstration, I'm not worrying as much the kind of final aesthetics of the piece, is just kind of demonstrating how far you can take things. Within the blank, you're going to get a little ridge at that low point of the square, and then the top part of the square is going to tend to facet just a little bit and remain kind of flat and straight and not curved as much. And that's just how the tensions work within the structure of the metal as it's being spun and compressed. So I think with the aluminum I can push it just a little bit further. I want to just work that kind of ridge in to be a nice smooth curve for the piece. Bring those corners in just a touch. I think for demonstration purposes that gives you an idea, but you can see that kind of ridge at the bottom of the square, which is really hard to get to flow as evenly with the rest of the solid part of the blank. All right, and we'll see how far we can get with the copper. So I'll switch this out really quickly. Make sure I have enough lubricant on there. Definitely do not want to apply anything to the piece while it's spinning, staying far away from those corners. And even though it's the same gauge, copper is going to take a bit more force, but if you do too much force too far out towards the edge of the blank, you're going to cause it to collapse. So the most force is towards the base of the piece where the metal's solid, and then kind of easing up as it gets to the outer corners of the square. And again, with these smaller blanks, there's quite a bit of finesse as far as how much force you're going to use. And you can start seeing that transition of the curve into the flat part of the square. And probably with a finished piece, I would take this off and anneal it just so I don't get too many ripples or facets into the piece. But for the demonstration purposes, I'm just going to kind of keep going, see what happens. Now, if you push those corners of the square up too quickly, they can cause a ripple in the whole piece. You might be able to hear as the tool's just against those outer squares. And you can see that start of a wrinkle or facet there as the corners are kind of bending in as opposed to being compressed and spun like the solid part of the metal. So that's something that you want to watch with a regular shaped blank like squares. But that's a good starting point, or with a larger piece, maybe that's just the finished form that you're happy with. And there's all sorts of other edge treatments and things you could consider as well. These are just quick demo pieces. And then we'll compare this to the pewter. Now, given that pewter work softens, much easier to spin than even the aluminum, but it's much more care and finesse that you don't push too much too quickly and either tear out the base of the blank or cause the whole form to collapse in on itself. Pewter is very ductile, but if you push it too far too quick, it'll crack and fail. So just nice even strokes, kind of reducing the amount of force that I'm using as I get to those outer corners. Backspinning to maintain thickness. Really much less force, but still, it's still going to have pressures within the metal, and you can see those kind of bumps that you get at the low point of the square, and then almost the kind of the faceting or the flatness of those top parts of the square that tend to fold as opposed to actually being compressed and spun. We can go one more round just for sake of demonstration. See if I can work those corners in a little bit. Tighten the tailstock just a touch. But I think for this demonstration, I think that's good enough. And again, you can see that contrast of the compressed spun form versus the faceting that happens at the top of the square, and that's regardless of the type of metal. But it does give a very different kind of form than happens with round discs, and maybe this gives you some ideas for some new designs in your pieces. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you can hear from me when I post future videos. Thanks for stopping by.